Welcome to In Her Image, a podcast where we seek and celebrate our Mother God through scripture, scholarship, and everyday life. I'm your host, Meg Rittmanic, and today we are going to be talking about Snow White, which I'm so excited about. I recently watched the Disney video version of Snow White, and I really kind of had a spiritual experience while I watched it. I'm so touched and inspired by the courageous love that Snow White shows, that kind of conquers all and helps her to overcome her fears, but in the end also overcome the imposter of her kingdom. And also, as I was watching, really loved the moment where Dopey was very upset because everyone was making fun of him. Snow White goes outside and she really nurtures him and helps him to believe in himself in the way that only a mother or a father truly could do for a child. And through that beautiful nurturing moment, Dopey transforms into a different person. And I felt like there was a connection there to the divine feminine as I watched it. And I was also inspired by this meaningful connection to community through festival and friendship, which is completely opposite of the world that we live in now. And really, it is through those festivals and friendships that in the end of the movie, Snow White is able to turn the tides of her kingdom because she is able to recognize the one person who she had built intimate relationships with in her village. And as she called them by name and recalled their life and their passions and their joys, it reminded them who they were. And it was through that beautiful community and that festival in a village that created those kinds of connections. But even as I was watching the movie, my soul was asking me to dive deeper with Snow White. Look at Snow White as an archetypal story of the divine feminine. So I started looking for an expert who could really help initiate me in the ways of Snow White and the symbolic parable that it could be for our psyches. So really interesting, Hester Murdock and I just happened to cross paths when I was wanting to look into this more. And Hester is a storyteller, a writer, and a facilitator who has been working with the spiritual arena for women for about 13 years. Her work really focuses on reclaiming and healing the feminine through the narratives of story. She is an accomplished performance artist, and in 2017, she performed Carol Lynn Pearson's play about the Divine Mother who wove the morning in Provo Canyon. At the end of the summer, she won a national award for oral storytelling. She's performed on several stages, facilitated many circles, and is always happiest by the ocean. So I'm so excited to have this conversation about Snow White and her journey with Hester Murdock. So Hester, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm happy to be with you, and I'm glad that this is finally happening. We've had a lot of conversations leading up to this moment, and yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, Snow White has kind of demanded that we spend more time with the story to really dive deep and understand the nuances and also just the intricacies of how impactful the story really is. And I think also we had to spend that much time with it because the origin of the story is nothing like the Disney story, right?
Yeah, you're right about that. I hope that will help your listeners.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this story because I think it has the potential to really guide listeners through difficult experiences. I think most of our listeners know that I'm in love with the story of Inanna and that story has kind of helped guide me through some very difficult things in my life and has given me hope of where I'm headed with those difficult things. And I think the story of Snow White has the potential to do the same thing, maybe for different situations in my life, in society, and within some of our listeners' lives as well. So, Hester, why don't you tell us more about Snow White?
Yeah, so in a similar way that you have a close connection with Inanna, and the myth of her descent. I have a close relationship with this story, which really surprises me. I grew up on the animated film from the 90s, and I really disliked it. Found that character to be quite inane and hollow, and she didn't seem to really have a voice or volition. She was my least favorite Disney princess. So I was very surprised when, in my early 40s, this character popped up in my life and started to make sense in a different way and started to become very meaningful to me. I dream about her a lot, which is kind of odd, but I had a dream last year, and when I woke up, I couldn't remember anything except for this one sentence. And the sentence was, Snow White cuts her first wolf tooth. So I sat up and I wrote it down. And as we've been talking back and forth about our conversation today, I thought, oh, that might be where we can begin. Snow White cuts her first wolf tooth. So given your love for Inanna, I thought we would maybe begin our conversation with some really interesting folklore, beliefs, anthropological ideas. So in the world of the folklorist and the storyteller, people will say things like, it depends on who you're listening to, but people will say like, oh, there are only 5 stories in all of human history, or there are only 3. I've heard people say there's only 1. And a lot of folklorists, they'll categorize story by type, and there are a number of princess myths that have ancient counterparts. For example, Cinderella. Looks like the Cinderella story was actually born in ancient Egypt. There's a story from Egypt. I think it's called Rhodopis is the name of the story. And it's about a slave girl who went to the pharaoh's court, and the pharaoh fell in love with her. And he found her again with a sandal, a slipper. Beauty and the Beast is very likely derived from an old Greek myth called Cupid and Psyche, in which a bride falls in love with the son of the goddess of love, and he's invisible. And he lives in an enchanted palace. She falls in love with him without being able to see him. And then when she is kind of breaks her promise and lights a candle so that she can see him, he feels betrayed, and she has to descend to hell and come back in order to win his love. And the story of Snow White could potentially be another iteration of the Inanna myth. This one is not as easy to see the similarities up front, but they're there. You have 2 women in the story, one who's represents a force of destruction or descent, and one who represents life and transformation. And the woman who represents life and transformation is killed by the second woman, who is the destructive force. And this woman is resurrected, just like in the Inanna story. So some folklorists believe that Snow White probably got its start in Mesopotamia, which is kind of cool. Yeah, so I'll pause there. Anything you want to say about that?
It's so fascinating because as I was watching the show, and that is why I felt pulled to it, because I do have such a close relationship with Inanna. It really has been a transformative story for me. But as I was watching it, I just knew that there was more there that wasn't actually captured in the story of Snow White, and that I needed to dive in to understand what was there. And I did see those similarities. There's 7 dwarfs, and Inanna makes a descent through 7 gates. And so that definitely, piqued my interest and my curiosity. What could those 7 dwarfs possibly mean? And could they be specific symbols similar to the regalia that Inanna takes off and then puts back on through her descent and ascent and different things? So I'm excited to learn more about Snow White. And I feel like I've learned a lot through our conversations, and I'm excited to share that with our listeners.
Well, beautiful questions. I was pretty flabbergasted on our first phone call. We were discussing something different, and you, out of left field, started talking to me about Snow White and how you thought it was related to Inanna. And I was like, where did this woman come from? How did she, what? Where? It was, a little bit disorienting, actually. Yeah. So it's beautiful to see how your mind works and how you've connected these things. And hopefully it's affirming to know that there's a whole branch of anthropology where there are people who feel the same way.
Yeah, it's always fun for me when I start making a connection and then I find a lot of other people have figured that out before me. It's like, oh, I'm on the right path. It's just reaffirming all these little nuggets that I consider inspiration, to myself that are just like, wow, I feel like I'm being led to whatever it is I'm seeking
I understand.
in the divine feminine. So it's a beautiful path to take.
So, to kind of ground us as we move forward, we've talked a little bit about some of the similarities between Inanna's descent and the Snow White story. Let's talk about a few of the differences. There are two big ones that come to mind. I'm kind of going to steer our conversation in this direction for a little while. The first one is that the stories deal with the subject of wisdom very differently. In the Inanna myth, everything is cosmic. This woman is a goddess. She is descending to hell and back to heaven. Her sister is a goddess. She's hanging on a hook for 3 days. And so, when we think about wisdom as maybe a title for the divine feminine in antiquity, these ideas sit together really seamlessly, especially because Inanna was likely the precursor of Ishtar, who was likely related to Asherah. The names are all cognates. So if you're looking for the divine feminine in the Hebrew tradition, all roads kind of lead back to Inanna. So yeah, wisdom, the acquisition of wisdom in that story is very archetypal, very mythic, very cosmic. Whereas in the story about Snow White, it's developmental. So when Disney adapted the film in the 1930s, they changed the age of the protagonist. In the Brothers Grimm version of the story, which is our oldest written version of the story, Snow White was a child when the queen tried to eat her heart, 6 or 7 years old. So the fairy tale is grounded in human processes. It's about growing up, and it's about protecting the sacred, the pure, and the beautiful, and not only having protected by exterior forces, but learning to protect it in yourself. So in the world of Snow White, wisdom isn't so much about, giving a title to a goddess as it is about developing skillfulness and learning about navigating danger and human relationships and crafting instinct and building personal power to escape and confront dynamics that are harmful. Hence, I think Snow White cuts her first wolf tooth.
Yeah. So tell me more about that because it pulled me in, but I didn't understand what that means. What does that mean?
Well, most of what I'm going to be sharing with you on our podcast today about Snow White is material that I've learned from the writings and teachings of Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. Dr. Estes is most famous for her book, Women Who Run with the Wolves, Archetypes of the Wild Woman.
Yeah. Amazing book for all our listeners. If you haven't read it, read it.
Highly recommend. So Dr. Estes, she is Nahua, which is an indigenous group from Mexico. Westerners commonly call them Aztec. So she's of Nahua descent, but she was adopted by a family of German immigrants who came to the United States fleeing World War II. And they were quite old when they adopted her. So they're kind of like old world German artists and storytellers. And so she has a really beautiful lived sense of that tradition. And she brings to it this archetype of the wolf. And we'll be touching on that throughout the interview. But yeah, so I'm kind of marrying the work of Dr. Estes with this fairy tale. And I think that's what my psyche was up to when it kind of gave me that little dream fragment. But I would say that's something that's quite different between the stories. Inanna, again, it's this really cosmic template that can give us a lot of wisdom regarding how our souls operate and how they descend and ascend again. But Snow White, there are a few conventions that we'll get into later that are really more about developmental processes. And I think these are equally as important because we have to learn how to balance these two worlds. We have to learn how to live here too.
Yeah. So our listeners can kind of understand what are the differences between the Disney version and the original. What are the biggest things that they should kind of wrap their mind around before we dive deeper into this story?
Yeah. So a few to be aware of right at the onset. As I mentioned, in the Brothers Grimm version of the story, Snow White is a child. She's not a young woman. So she's 6 or 7 years old. And in the Grimm's version, the Wicked Queen tries to take Snow White's life 5 times rather than just once. So instead of the poisoned apple, we have well, I suppose in the animated film, there are 2 attempts because she tries to send the huntsman after Snow White and the huntsman decides against it. That happens in the Grimm's version as well. But in the Grimm's version, we also have a poisoned corset and a poisoned comb and the poisoned apple, and then a final attempt that happens at the wedding between Snow White and the handsome prince. And so you can see why, from a storytelling perspective, maybe it's like, let's just simplify that. We don't need all that extra stuff. But that template is actually very true to how this works for human beings, how it works for us generationally and personally. Usually we aren't able to overcome a foe the first time around. We build awareness and wisdom by circling and re-entering the same dynamic over and over again. It's how we learn lessons, right? So that's a really important part of the story that I think a disservice was done to the story when that was removed. Another element of the story that went missing involves the dwarves. So in the story, the Grimm's version, the dwarves are kind of the arbiters of justice. They're the ones who decide when enough is enough. So the dwarves are the arbiters of justice. They decide when enough is enough, and they're the ones who intervene and put a stop to the queen through kind of a very definitive form of justice. They build her a pair of silver shoes, they put them in a hot fire and make her wear them at the wedding that she wasn't invited to. So in the Disney version, the dwarves are kind of banalized. They're simplified and turned into like comic relief, like slapstick characters. But in the fairy tale, they're very powerful figures. There's a reason that Snow White runs to them for help and for protection. So those are the main differences in my mind between what you might be familiar with from the Disney tradition and what's in the version that was written down by the Grimm's brothers. But there's another difference too that I'd like to address, and this one requires us to zoom out a little bit farther. So in a long time ago, in Catholicism, when the Catholic Church would invade a new territory or a new land, one of the ways that they would amass power is by destabilizing the spiritual traditions of the people who lived on the land that they were invading. And one of their methods for that is something called integralism. Integralism is what happens theologically when a dominating group says, we're the only ones who have the truth, and we have all of the truth. All the truth already belongs to us. So we're just going to grab whatever it is that you believe, and we're going to fit it into our narrative. And if it doesn't fit, then it's not true, and you can't practice it anymore. Now, that's not the only strategy that the Catholic Church employed all through Europe and, of course, Central America and Northern America and numerous other places in Africa and things. But it's an important one for the sake of our conversation because it's something that we want to avoid when we're talking about Snow White. So I want to give you an example of what this might look like. So if what you're doing fits in to our narrative, we'll keep it and we'll tell you it was already ours because we're the only ones who have the truth. But if it doesn't, then you're not allowed to practice it anymore. And yeah, we don't want to see it. So this is a political strategy. It's a way to weaken and diminish a nation's sense of itself, their soulfulness, and their connection to the land. Usually indigenous spiritual practices and beliefs have some connection to the land that a group of people is living on. So I mentioned integralism in the context of Snow White because this is something that pops up sometimes when I'm talking about European fairy tales in Christian circles or in Mormon circles. There's a temptation to look at the story through the lens of the gospel. So an example of that might be someone saying, look, Snow White takes a bite of forbidden fruit. That's kind of like Adam and Eve. Or look, Snow White dies and is resurrected. That's kind of like Jesus Christ. And I don't mind, parallelism. And we were drawing some parallels already between Snow White and Inanna. But within the context of this story, when we kind of draw those parallels between the Judeo-Christian tradition and Snow White, what we're actually doing is repeating a cycle of harm that we might not even know or realize that our ancestors experienced. So if you're like Meg and I, and you have fair skin, and you are predominantly of European descent, and you've been living in the United States for the last 5 years, you've probably come into contact with ideas about colonialism and anti-racism and appropriation. And maybe you've left those conversations wondering, like, well, where's my culture? What did my ancestors believe? Like, why don't I have anything, that is equivalent to maybe what I'm seeing in Native American circles or in African American circles, et cetera. So there is an answer to that question. There are a couple. One answer was articulated by James Baldwin, and that is that when Europeans immigrated to the United States, they all kind of decided to just become one big, massive lump of white. And they were all like, yeah, forget it. We don't need to be Italian or Irish or Polish. We're all just going to be this new thing, white. But there's another answer that predates that one. And that answer involves the history of Christianity. So I'm of Germanic descent. Meg and I talked. She's of Germanic descent. She has ancestors who were Swiss. And I have ancestors who were German who moved to Pennsylvania to work in the coal mines. And our ancestors, they first encountered Catholicism like the same century as the Nicene Creed was written. So quick refresh on Christian history. Jesus Christ dies, and then Peter, who's recognized as the first pope, runs off and gets a movement moving. And after a while, it's developed, and there are a lot of converts. And there are so many that there are holy wars happening between the Christians and the pagans. And to end these holy wars, the emperor of Rome converts to Christianity, and he makes Christianity the state religion. That same century was the first time that the Romans invaded the area in Europe that we now call Germany. That same century. And those invasions lasted for like 1,000 years. Germany is a really interesting spot because it's right in the middle of Western Europe. And so it's been war-torn almost all throughout its history. And that means that in Germany, there has been a lot of culture that's been lost, a lot of traditions and spiritual pathways. And you can trace it back to the influence of Catholicism. Now, Catholicism had such a sway in Europe that I think, with the exception of maybe the Sami people, who are the indigenous people in Scandinavia, like way, way up north, there aren't really any indigenous people left in Europe who don't also have Christianity somewhere in their lineage. And so, for us who are of American descent, we're even farther removed from these traditions. And most of our ancestors decided to distance themselves even more. So I bring all this up because I can get kind of sensitive when the only interaction that they want to have with a fairy tale like this is to see if it validates their Christian testimony. And the reason I feel sensitive about that is because there's an opportunity here for us to actually build a small inroad into reconnecting with our own ancestors and with their culture. And I think that's a very sacred thing. And I think it's also really needed in order for us to show up to these broader conversations that are happening with some sense of stability and surroundedness. Invite you into considering that there might be some complexity here that you haven't thought about before, and that you might have people in your lineage who were also on both sides of the fence. If you were to go far back enough in your own history, you might have ancestors who were dominators, and you might have ancestors who were not. And one of the great losses in what's happened in our European history is actually, Snow White.
You were explaining to me that Snow White really comes up in the psyche of a society when there is some kind of organization or some kind of ruling idea or concept or political regime that needs to fall and needs to be replaced. So
That's right. Yeah. So that's something that I learned from Dr. Estes. She said that some of these same folklorists who draw comparisons between Inanna and Snow White also say that these stories have a way of coming up in the collective conscious this, usually right around the time that there's a big empire that's in decline or that there's like an empire that's about to fall. Fascinating. I can explain this more clearly in terms of Snow White than Inanna, but I'll take a stab at it and we'll kind of see where we end up. The story of Snow White it's a developmental story, but if we look at it in terms of what these characters symbolize, specifically Snow White herself and the Wicked Queen, we see that the story is essentially political. Snow White represents purity, but she also represents the force of transformation. She's the appropriate heir for this kingdom that she's born into. And there's a presence who comes in and this is the presence of empire as represented by the Wicked Queen. So this is a political presence that is dominating, that means the kingdom and the force of transformation harmed. And so we can talk about Snow White as a developmental myth, which we're going to do later on in the interview. And we can also talk about it as a political myth. And we can talk about how this process that the force of transformation Snow White goes through, where she's looping around and building sightfulness, building the capacity to see the harm for what it is and ultimately to fight it off. That is the same force that informs and has informed all of the great revolutions throughout history. There's this force of transformation, a force of change that's coming up against a force of domination, an institution that will not change. And ultimately, the force of transformation wins out, and that's what creates the revolution. So in order for that to happen, an empire somewhere has to fall. So I suppose the reason that these stories come up in the collective consciousness when this process has already begun is because it's something that revolutionaries might draw inspiration from. It's a story that's instructive at times when empires need to fall. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting that it has come back up right now. And what is that saying about where we're at and what we need as society right now in our lives and in our psyches?
I think there are a lot of beautiful connections with all of the last points that we've covered. We're in a time right now that some people have called a polycrisis. So there are all kinds of issues that are coming to a head socially, culturally, economically, and importantly, environmentally. And right now we have multiple institutions, including governmental institutions, religious institutions, social institutions that are not yielding to the change and the transformation that's necessary for our species to actually survive. So I would point to that as maybe the most clear reason as to why these stories, Snow White and Inanna, might be coming back up to the surface again.
Okay. Tell me why stories like Snow White are so important for us. What aspects of stories kind of lead our psyche to healing or to understanding or to greater wisdom? And then how does Snow White do this for us?
So the advent of psychology in Europe came about at the same time that European indigenous and pagan cultures were dying out. And that's likely causal. So these indigenous cultures, these European pagan cultures, in order to teach lessons, in order to heal the mind, they wouldn't invite people to sit in an office across a table from each other and talk it out. They would tell stories. So stories were roadmaps. They were moral lessons, ways to entertain, but also ways to kind of make sense of what's going on inside and how to resolve it. So Snow White follows the same logic. It exists in that same universe. It's a story to teach important lessons. Unfortunately, the way that Disney oversimplified it, all of those lessons are gone. And the only lesson people come away with is like, oh, you better find a handsome prince who can give you a magic kiss.
Which is so funny because in the original story, that isn't even an aspect of what brings her back to life, right?
Right.
Her coffin is like dropped and the apple chunk comes out of her mouth.
Yep, it gets dislodged when the coffin gets starred.
I think that's just the best part of the story. Who would have been the intended audience of Snow White back 600 years ago, 1,000 years ago.
There's this misconception that fairy tales are for children, and they weren't in pagan European contexts. These were stories for adults and for young adults entering adulthood, which is why they're often so violent and so dark. Yeah, these are stories about things that real adult humans struggle with, including relationships with people who want to do them harm. Maybe they had some kind of old Germanic mystery school, or maybe they told the story around the fire.
You had mentioned in a previous conversation that we had that possibly Snow White was like a matriarchal myth that was intended for women, given by women as a warning and also a way to kind of process potential betrayals or rejection that they experience. Do you want to expand on that?
So I was talking about something that Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes has written in her book, Women Home with the Wolves. She says that, long ago in village-based or community-based societies, you would have older women, elders, and one of their roles in a community like this is they are kind of the masters of the psyche because they've lived the longest, they've seen the most, and presumably they've acquired the most wisdom. I want to pause here and say that doesn't actually translate well to the modern day because we have lost all of these processes. Today, we have more women who are over the age of 60 than have ever been on planet Earth all at the same time. And yet, I don't think it's fair to say that we have more wisdom. Our culture, definitely in North America, is a culture of infantilization. And so we don't actually support women in growing up. We don't encourage them to grow up. And so there are a lot of women who are older, but elders, wise women, are kind of in short supply. But, long ago in these more village-based indigenous cultures, there would have been women who were elders, who were through their childbearing years, and one of their roles would have been to help other women develop themselves spiritually and psychologically. So yeah, a story like Snow White is really instructive in teaching lessons about who to trust and when not to trust someone, and how to identify when someone means you harm, and also how to rebuild yourself if you have been targeted in a way that diminishes you. So yeah, I think Dr. Estes would say that these stories come out of a tradition of older women teaching younger women important lessons. And even though that structure might be broken down, we still have the vehicle through which the lessons were taught. And so that's a way that we can kind of acquaint ourselves with the choreography.
So, how does a story like Snow White help someone that has experienced betrayal or experienced rejection or has experienced some kind of force coming at them, trying to kill them, process through that trauma in an effective way, or maybe even a more gentle way than actually looking at that trauma experience?
Well, the first easiest way for me to answer that question isn't so much by saying how it happens as it is just like pointing you and your listeners to your own lived experience. If you think about the stories that meant the most to you growing up, whether they were movies or books, usually you gravitate towards something that speaks to you, that speaks to what you value, that reminds you of something that you've experienced, or that tells you something about who you are. And that's just a natural human impulse. I mean, you kind of had that experience watching the 2025 remake of Snow White. There you are, you're just watching a story, and somehow there's a part of you that's dialoguing with it. You're having a conversation. And none of the filmmakers have to be involved. It's just one of the mysterious powers of art. And this is something that humans have been practicing, especially around story, basically since humans started speaking to each other. We've been telling stories. Humans love stories. So regarding the specifics, I think maybe it's just better to listen to the story and kind of let it wash over you and see what it brings up for you. So as we're kind of moving in the direction of me telling the story, I wanted to put a few invitations out into the air before I tell the story. The first one is I'd like to invite you and your listeners to just sort of softly release any ideas or preconceptions you might have about this story needing to mean one particular thing. I work a lot with women who are Mormon or were Mormon. And I often ask them to, at least within the framework of my classes, I ask them to just gently let go of the need for this to be like somehow a testimony builder or somehow factor into, all of the truth claims. Like it doesn't have to be the gospel. It doesn't have to be that stressful. Like you're not going to get tested on this. You don't have to understand anything in order to make it into some afterlife. Like, no, 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 no. It's just a story. And actually, what we really want is for you to have a personal dialogue with it, for you to connect with it in the way that you're going to connect with it. And it's lovely, I think, when those differences arise and when we really allow for that. So, similarly, I'd like to invite you to practice protecting what's at the heart of this story. So, try to leave any desire to, fit it into any theology that you may love at the door. Try to just engage it on its own terms and have whatever relationship you have with it. And it's safe for you to do that. So those will be my invitations as we're getting ready to settle into the story.
Beautiful.
And
Those are great invitations.
all right. So the story. A very, very long time ago, in a village near a forest, near where your ancestors may have lived for a very long time, a queen was pregnant with a long desired baby, and she sat by a window in the snow. The windowsill was made of ebony, and it was winter time, and there were a few inches of fresh snow on the windowsill. And the queen was sewing with a needle. She pricked her finger, and a fresh drop of red blood fell onto the snow. And when she looked at these colors together, sitting there, red, white, and black, she knew the name of the child that she would carry. The girl's name would be Snow White, and she would have hair as black as ebony, and lips as red as blood, and skin as fair and white as the snow. This queen died shortly after Snow White was born, and the king remarried another queen from a land far away. After the king passed, his new bride became the queen, and she was not fond of Snow White, even though Snow White was still just a young child. The new queen was very power hungry and obsessed with herself. She saw her beauty as her surest road to power, and so she kept a magic mirror that she would often gaze into to ask about how her beauty was faring. And she would say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And for many years, the mirror would reply, and the mirror would confirm that the queen was the most beautiful and the most powerful in all of the land. And so the queen would be relieved until the next time an insecurity arose. Now, one day, when the girl who was the heir to the throne, Snow White, was only 6 years of age, and the queen went into her chamber with the magic mirror, and she asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror surprised her and said, "Thou art fair, my queen, 'tis true, but there is one who is fairer than you." And the queen said, "Who? Who could it be?" And the mirror said, "Snow White." And this threw the queen into an inconsolable rage. How could a child be more beautiful than she is, or that she was? Who would this child grow to be if already at the tender age of 6, she was more beautiful than the queen? The queen couldn't have this threat to her power, to her throne, and so she ordered her huntsman to kill Snow White and to bring back Snow White's heart as proof that the deed had been done. And so the huntsman packed up Snow White on his horse and drove far, far away from the palace where the queen lived in the village. But as he rode with this child in his arms, the hair like ebony and the lips as red as blood and the skin as white as snow, He could feel her purity and her innocence, and he just couldn't bring himself to carry out the queen's orders. And so he brought her to the edge of the forest, and he told her to run deep into the forest and to find help, and to be very, very careful because the queen would come after her again if she found out that Snow White was living. The huntsman killed a deer and presented the deer's heart to the queen, who was fooled by the ruse and made herself a great stew with the heart and ate it. Meanwhile, little Snow White did run deep into the forest, and she was looking for help, hoping that she would find someone out there who could protect her. The animals were very helpful. She followed a bird's song until she came to a little glen in the forest, and there she found a cottage that was just her size. The door was just the right size for a person 6 years of age, and inside there was a small table with small chairs set with small plates and cups and cutlery, and there were little beds, little dishes, and little socks and little clothes. Snow White thought that this place must have been created just for her. She felt right at home immediately. So she helped herself to the bread on the table, and she gave herself some milk, and she crawled into one of the little beds and tucked herself in and fell asleep. This cottage was home to guardians who had lived in this forest for a very, very long time. These were the 7 dwarves. During the day, they spent their time deep in the belly of the earth. They were treasure finders. They knew how to mine for rubies and diamonds and sapphires and emeralds. And they knew how to find veins of gold, and they knew how to smelt silver. And they knew treasure when they saw it. So that night, when they came home to their cottage and they found a little spook in their bed, and when she sat up with her hair all disheveled and her eyes wide, well, the dwarves knew that they had just found the greatest treasure of their lives. Now, dwarves are usually very grumpy little creatures. They don't care much for humans. They don't care much for niceties. But these 7 dwarves were all heart, and they loved Snow White from the moment that they laid eyes on her. And they knew that they would do everything that they could to protect her. And so they taught her and they told her, sweetheart, your mother's out to get you, and she's not going to stop. So when we're gone, you absolutely cannot let anyone into this home. You must be very careful. And Snow White said, okay, I understand. And so a rhythm started, and the dwarves would descend into the belly of the earth to mine, and Snow White would stay in the forest, and she would cook and she would clean and she would sew and she would care for the animals. And sure enough, the months went by and the years went by before the queen got the itch again, and she went to check the mirror just to be sure. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? You are fair, my queen, 'tis true, but there is one who is more fair than you. What? Who could it be? 'Tis Snow White, my queen. Snow White? That huntsman told me she was dead. He lied to me? The queen summoned the huntsman, told him that he would pay for Snow White's life with his, and then she decided she would take matters into her own hands. She couldn't trust her staff. She could trust herself. And so she disguised herself as a very old woman. She ventured into the woods until she found the cottage where the little dwarves lived by night. She knocked on the door, and Snow White, a few years older now, opened it. The wicked queen wheedled and hunched over and said, oh, my dear, I'm a peddler from the village, just stopping through. Can I show you my wares? And Snow White said, I appreciate you stopping by, grandmother, but I'm not in the market for anything. And the wicked queen pressed and said, but darling, it's all the rage in the village. Have you heard about the corset? Here, I'll show you. Turn around and I'll lace it up just like this, and I'll cinch it up just like this. And you're so beautiful with that ebony hair and those red, red lips and that fair skin. This will make you even more beautiful, and beauty is power, my dear. So just let me cinch you in a little. And the queen cinched Snow White into that corset so tight that Snow White fell down. The queen ran back home, sure that she had taken care of the problem this time. And when the dwarves came home that night, they were shocked and horrified to find Snow White on the floor, practically dead, or dead. They tried to find the matter They tried to find what had gone wrong, and finally they spotted the corset underneath her dress. So they cut her out of it, and as soon as she was removed from the corset, she sat up, took a big deep breath in, and she was back. And the dwarves chided her. They said, "Snow White, what happened?" She said, "There was a little old lady, and I opened the door, and then before I knew it, I was wearing this corset." And the dwarf said, "We told you, your mother is out to get you. You cannot let anyone into this house. We need you to be safe. You mean so much to us. You are our treasure." And Snow White said, "Okay, all right, I'll do better." So months went by and months turned into years. And eventually the queen got the itch again. And so she went to the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror said, "You are fair, 'tis true, my queen, but there is one more beautiful than thee." And couldn't stand it. Who could possibly be more beautiful than me in this kingdom? And the mirror said, "'Tis Snow White, my queen." Snow White! The queen would level up this time. So she disguised herself again. She marched into that forest, carrying with her a new wear this time, and she rapped on the front door of the cottage where Snow White was living. And this time, Snow White only opened a window. And the wicked queen wheedled, "Darling, how are you? I've come from such a long way. And I heard about how good you are to the dwarves. And I thought I could present a little gift to you, something to accent that beautiful ebony hair of yours." And Snow White said, "I don't think so. I really shouldn't, probably." But the woman was so nice and so kind. And so when she reached in through the window and slid the beautiful jade comb into Snow White's hair, well, Snow White was defenseless. And so she just fell down dead. And the queen cackled and laughed all the way back to the castle, sure that the problem had been taken care of this time. When the dwarves came home and they found Snow White dead on the ground, well, they checked her for a corset first thing, but they couldn't find one. And so then one of the dwarves spotted the jade comb just tucked up against her scalp. And so he pulled it out of her hair, and Snow White sat up and took a deep breath in and said, "Snow White, what happened this time?" She said, "I only opened the window. I just wasn't expecting this, not in the form of a poisoned comb." And the dwarf said, "Snow White, your mother is out to get you. You have to be more careful. We love you so much. We can't stand it when we lose you like this. Please, we want you to be safe." Snow White said she'd try hard. Months turned into years before it happened a third time. The wicked queen approached her mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror responded in the same way as usual. "It's Snow White." The queen was determined that this time she would concoct a plan so fatal that Snow White would never rise again. So when she made her way to the woodland cottage and she knocked on the door and Snow White opened the window, she knew she'd have to be more clever than she was before. And so this time she presented herself not as a peddler, not as an artisan, just as a friendly neighbor strolling by after an apple harvest. "Darling, my apples have just given me the most gorgeous fruit, and I wondered if I could just share one with you." Snow White was so lonely, and she so wished to be mothered, and this woman seemed to be so kind. Surely it wouldn't hurt if she just had a bite. But then she remembered, wait, the dwarves have been telling me about this. Wait. And, the wicked queen, she had been going through her own evolutions. She'd been getting wilier, much more clever herself. So this time, her apple was only poisoned on one side. And so to alleviate Snow White's fears, she said, "Look, there's nothing wrong with this fruit. I'll show you." And she bit into the side of the apple that had not been poisoned. She was fine. And the apple was so mouthwatering and so juicy. And so Snow White reached through the window, grabbed the fruit, and bit into the poisoned side. And yes, she fell down dead. Well, for months and months and years afterwards, every time the queen approached her mirror, finally the answer came back that she wanted. She was the fairest. And the dwarves, well, when the dwarves came home that night, they checked her for a corset and they checked her for a comb and they checked her feet and her arms and her head and her back for wounds of any kind. And they could find nothing and they could not resuscitate her, and they mourned and mourned the loss of their greatest treasure. But as you've noticed listening to this story so far, there's something about Snow White that defies the odds. See, Snow White isn't a person so much as she is a symbol of the powers of rebirth. That's why she never completely dies. She always comes back every time. And that was true this time as well. She was dead, but not decaying, dead, but just as beautiful as she'd ever been. And so the dwarves, they mined their most beautiful jewels and their gold, and they fashioned her a coffin, which they placed in the middle of a glen of trees, surrounded by all of her favorite flowers and animals. It had a gold base encrusted with jewels and a glass top, so that the dwarves could come and visit her and be close to her, even though she could no longer speak or uh, look them in the eye. And time passed, and one day a prince rode by with a group of his men. And as he passed this coffin and saw the woman inside, he was surprised to see his heart leap inside of his chest in recognition. Now, to our modern ears, this sounds awfully strange, but within the world of the story, it's not so strange. The prince found out who she was and found out who her caretakers were, who her guardians were, and he approached them and said, I have no way to account for what has happened, but I know that that woman, that she is a part of me and she belongs in my life, and I think if I walk away without her, that I will never be happy again. I promise I will take good care of her. I will build her a shrine just as beautiful as the one that you've built, and I'll make sure that she's safe and protected. And the dwarves, they were a very good judge of character, and they could see into his heart, and they knew that he was a good man and a man of his word. And they too could feel this ineffable mystery that he was describing, and so they agreed that they would send Snow White to the kingdom of this prince. So he had his men load up the coffin onto some kind of wagon, and she was kind of heavy. And so as they were loading her up, one of the men tripped and stumbled, and he dropped the coffin. And as the coffin lurched against the ground, the force of the drop pushed the chunk of poisoned apple that had been lodged in Snow White's throat all the way out. So the coffin shattered, and she sat up just as erect as if she had been living the whole time. And the prince, seeing her now in her awakened state, fell more in love with her than he could have imagined. And she returned his feelings and decided with the blessing of the dwarves that she would go to his kingdom and become his bride. Now, by this time, the dwarves had done their good work. They had given the queen many, many chances to show who she really was and many chances to redeem herself. And they were pretty certain, as they'd always been, that the queen wouldn't stop until she was contained. And so when news of Snow White's engagement spread throughout the many kingdoms and many villages, the dwarves began to build a pair of silver shoes for the queen. And the dwarves attended the wedding of Snow White and the prince as honored guests, Snow White's 7 little fathers. And they put these silver shoes in the fire and let them get hot, waiting for the queen to arrive. And they were right about her. She found out in front of the mirror one more time that Snow White was still living. And this time, when she flew into a rage, the mirror cracked and shattered, and big droplets of water rushed out from behind it, just like tears. The mirror was heartbroken that in this final hour that the queen had chosen domination and control and madness over change and transformation and growth. And so in a frenzy, the queen arrived at the wedding of Snow White and the prince, hell-bent on killing her one more time. But before she could, the dwarves put her feet into the silver shoes that they had made. And so the queen danced herself in a frenzy to death. And Snow White and the king were able to establish a new kingdom. They were able to bring transformation and mature purity to their people. And that's why they say Snow White and the king lived happily ever after.
So amazing, Esther. Hester, thank you so much for telling that version of Snow White. Let's maybe take some time to kind of dive into this. I think what's so fascinating about the story is the learning process, right? I loved how you talked about how the type of wisdom that Snow White gets is it's a wisdom that she gains through experience. through these experiences of coming face to face with her mortal enemy and the thing that wants to destroy her over and over and over again. And it literally killing her, right? Creating this death in her life. I think it's fascinating that as soon as she takes off the corset, as soon as she takes out the barrette, as soon as she, chokes up the apple, that she's restored to her original state. I feel like many times when we go through a death, we do not become who we were before. It's an interesting aspect of Snow White. She still retains this like purity. She still retains this innocence and love.
I'm
And
glad,
somehow those deaths don't destroy that quality of who she is, right?
I'm glad you're saying that. You know, what's interesting is what you'll often notice with adult women is that many of us believe that these qualities of purity and innocence they have a deadline. And so it's like you can be pure and innocent as a child, but then, once you encounter the world or trauma, people believe that they've lost their innocence or they've lost their purity. And so what happens is there's this schism that arises in adult women. And on the one side, you'll have women who are maybe grieving the loss of their own innocence, who feel like it's gone and it won't come back. And then on the other side, you have women who are still very childlike, still very immature psychologically. So they do have like a pure quality, but they also maybe are guileless. They don't have an ability to sense danger in others, to sense shadow, to see the predator. Yeah, you've tapped into exactly what is happening in this story about Snow White. Every time she, goes through this cycle with this wicked queen, these qualities in her are growing and they're strengthening. So when we get to the end of her story, we don't have a figure who feels like disenchanted or feels broken, feels like she's lost that essential quality. We also don't have a figure who's a child anymore who can't see when someone means her harm. What we have is something very different: the holy, the sacred, the innocent, manifested in a form that can protect it and that can see and distinguish between forces on the outside that are healthy and well intentioned and forces that aren't. So I think this is, if we kind of revisit earlier strands of our conversation, this is one of the major gifts that Snow White has to offer women. It's a third path forward where you can keep the beauty, the purity, and the innocence, but you can mature them in ways that don't put them at risk anymore. And that's, I think, one of the icons that the story of Snow White brings forward in a beautiful way.
I think another thing that it brings forward is this repeating pattern of like, oh, you would have thought she would have learned the lesson the first time. Oh, nope, she didn't learn the lesson the first time. She's going to learn it the second time, though. Oh, nope, she did not learn it the second time or the third time. Unfortunately, she didn't learn the lesson the third time. And even at the very end, what it seems like is it is a divine intervention from those seven dwarfs that helps her to fully learn the lesson, to be fully protected from this force that wants to destroy her. And I think that's really interesting because in one of our previous conversations, you mentioned how the dwarfs in different theology from Europe are the ones who live in the roots of the world tree.
That's right.
And they are the ones that like forge the tell us more about them because I think they're such interesting characters. And I think it's something I really want to talk about a little more is these seven dwarfs.
Yeah. So, like we discussed, Germanic traditions have been really fractured by Catholic colonization over the last 2,000 years. But further north in Scandinavia, Catholic invasion happened 800 years after it happened in the German forests and valleys. And by the time Catholic invasion happened up there, people were already writing down their myths and stories And we know that this culture at one point probably would have spanned that entire section of Europe. So we can kind of understand the dwarves in the Snow White story by looking at how dwarves appear in Nordic myth and in Germanic myth further north. So in Nordic myth, there's a great big tree. It's called Yggdrasil. It's the tree of life. And there are kingdoms within that tree. And one of them is the kingdom of Nidavellir. And like you were saying, Nidavellir is a cave, basically. It's a mine that is at the base of the tree. And this is the domain of the dwarves. Again, in Nordic myth, dwarves aren't goofy, bashful, grumpy, dopey, sad. Dwarves are rugged, ruthless miners, builders, crafters. They are the arbiters of justice. So if you've seen like any of the movies, the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies about Thor, and you know that hammer that he wields, the Mjolnir, that was built by dwarves. If you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings series of films or books, J.R.R. Tolkien, his representation of dwarves is based on the Nordic archetype. So Gimli is way closer to probably what these 7 dwarves were, you know, originally intended to represent than Doc and bashful and sneezy, you know, kind of like gruff, very connected to the earth, very sentient. Yeah. So there's an interesting thing that happens in European stories. It's really common for heroines and protagonists to go out into the woods. And the way that folklorists and anthropologists understand that is that the woods are basically where the old gods live, because civilization and the villages, these are places where it's easier for colonization to enter and establish a presence. And so the old ways of being and knowing, to survive, they go out into the wilderness. Now, as someone who loves the divine feminine in a Judeo-Christian context, you're very familiar with that architecture. You know that one. You've seen it in
Yeah.
Judeo-Christian writings as well, that when something divine is excised, it goes into the wilderness. So, you know, in like Judaic writings, the wilderness is a desert because that's where these cultures were living. But in European traditions, the wilderness is the forest. And the deeper you go in, the closer you're going to get to those old gods. So yeah, it's interesting that Snow White is fleeing civilization into a forest, and she's going really deep into a forest. That tells us that she's looking for an older form of spiritual help and support. And when she gets there, she finds the dwarves, who, again, in Nordic myth, are the arbiters of justice. And it's almost like she's kind of going through a long process with them where she's learning lessons about how to protect herself and how to see clearly. And you can interpret the story many ways. I think what I've learned about European paganism, you know, how we were talking earlier about how these stories are kind of like psychology before psychology. So the idea is you might resonate with like a specific character, but back then, like all of the characters could represent aspects of a single person's psyche. So you might have an inner wicked queen. You might have like an inner complex that wants to do you harm, like a self-saboteur. And you might have inner dwarves who want to help you understand what's at risk and want to help you build those silver shoes. And then you might also have an inner Snow White, who is this a representation of purity, real beauty, and also the potentiality to continually be reborn. So yeah, that's what I would say about those dwarves.
Yeah. And I think the dwarfs were something that really piqued my interest as I watched the show. I just thought these 7 dwarfs, I just wonder if there's a connection there to like Mary Magdalene and the 7 layers of the tree of life and her ascending up through those. And each one of those layers, she has this that approaches her and is tempting her to become something that is not divine. And she rejects that and she obtains a quality that helps her to make an ascension to the next level. So, for example, one is foolishness and then she gains wisdom. It would just be fascinating if maybe there was a tie there. You know, it's not a part of the story, but my imagination wants to make it part of the story of this idea of like these dwarfs there teaching her about these different qualities that help her to learn, and the idea that they are like these divine beings that kind of intervene and help her in some way, I think is interesting to me. Anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I did some research about this for you. And what I found is that the number 7 isn't really significant in Nordic myth. You'll see the number 3 pop up a lot, the number 12. But 7 doesn't really, like, I can't find any other setting where that would be an important number. So, in terms of Snow White, there are a couple of things that could be at play. Firstly, a lot of these European stories, they did change and evolve as they ended up in conversation with Catholicism. So it's possible that that might actually be a point of overlay that maybe, because 7 is a very important number in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it's possible that maybe there weren't originally 7 dwarves. Maybe it was a different number. And then perhaps some Christian thinker, adapted it. That could be. We've also talked about how some folklorists think that Snow White may have threads that connect her to the tale of Inanna, and the number 7 factors quite prominently into that myth. So yeah, I couldn't really find anything that would draw a clear connection between the dwarves and what you're suggesting. But again, that's one of the really beautiful things about fairy tales. I feel very comfortable with you engaging with the elements of the story that speak to you. And it's nice for me to be like, yeah, that doesn't really resonate with me, but it's okay if it resonates with you. And really lovely, actually. Maybe there's some art for you to create out of that, or some door that will open in your own process if you tease that thread out. But you're free to engage with it in the way that you're comfortable with.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. That is the fun part about storytelling is using your imagination to think about different aspects and how it could maybe fit into your life. I think also sometimes with stories, even as you were telling the story, I found myself wanting to oversimplify the story, making it about how beauty is the evil thing and that we shouldn't seek beauty, and that the queen was all about beauty. And then she's the one that tries to kill Snow White by putting corset on her, which makes her more beautiful, or giving her a clip in her hair, which makes her more attractive. And tempts her by these things. How do we avoid oversimplifying stories like this into narratives like that?
Great question. Well, first I want to say that like what you've just described is really, really common. About a year and a half ago, I had a roommate, someone who was a Mormon, and this person wanted to talk about fairy tales. I can tell you that she was so upset about fairy tales. She felt like they had ruined her life. They had given her false expectations about romantic love and how it was all going to play out. Yeah, they had set her up for failure. She also felt like it was actually tied up in the church, which was so fascinating. I was like, I spend so many hours a day thinking about this. This is so great. Yeah, so she felt like somehow she'd even gotten the message at church that these like happily ever after narratives were realistic or attainable. And she felt that they were very patriarchal and very diminishing to her as a woman. So I would say this is one of the reasons why these stories were not intended for children, to be honest with you. Thinking about things in terms of black and white, thinking about things really literally. These are all functions of the childhood psyche. And this woman wasn't wrong either. So we talked earlier about Catholic colonization and how that affected our ancestral cultures. And there's some really fine point differences that have to be made in that conversation. Like, for example, when I'm talking about Catholic colonization and Christian colonization, it can really easily sound like I'm saying Christianity is bad. That's massively an oversimplification of what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying at all. For the record, I love Jesus. I just don't think Jesus would be the type to, pillage a German ancestral tradition. That's what the Wicked Queen would do, actually. That's her deal, right? And Jesus and the Wicked Queen don't have much in common. So, But those things can collapse. Those threads can get really tangled. And then before you know it, one of the world's evils, and it's a really bad thing. I don't believe that, but I do think that depending on where a person is in their relationship with any ideology, any story can be used for good or for bad. And it could be understood in ways that are damaging or not useful. There are definitely people who use Christian stories in ways to damage others. And there are also people who use fairy tales in ways to limit listeners and to constrain them. And so that's one of the differentiations that we have to learn to make. And oddly enough, like that particular differentiation is, I think, at the very heart of Snow White. That's exactly the lesson that Snow White is trying to learn.
Right.
So yeah, how do we not oversimplify it? Well, we just practice. We just practice, yeah, developing the capacity for more complex thought and also for symbolic thought, which is part of growing up.
Yeah. Let's dive into that topic a little bit deeper. Just the idea of oversimplifying the story to the point where it loses its meaning, or maybe doesn't even, doesn't capture the original intent, right? So the way that Snow White has been depicted in the Disney films, for instance, does not actually capture the intent of the story at all. And even my experience with watching the Snow White was basically only seeing the end of the story, the arrival, but it doesn't show the process of getting to the place of that beauty, of that incredible power that's able to conquer that thing that wants to destroy anything that's beautiful, anything that's full of love, anything that's full of nurturing, anything that is innocent and pure. But it was powerful to see it displayed, see love displayed as something that could overcome hatred, overcome envy, that societal type of thought that is, we must dominate, we must own, we must overcome, we must separate, we must, obey kind of mentality that really has destroyed our world that we currently have, right? Every horrible thing that's ever happened in our world is because of that dominating type of society. And we haven't seen a lot of success where love has been able to overcome that yet. But the idea that it potentially could is inspiring in and of itself. In our society that we live in right now, we want to skip all of the hard and go straight to the good, the winning part. We don't want to look at the death, how death is written. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So regarding how this fairy tale shows us love conquering, yeah, you're right. It's not really a common story in human history. Although I think on the level of like an individual, maybe it happens more than we think. But in terms of like, countries and institutions and these kinds of things, it's not something we see very much of. And I think that's something to mourn, something to grieve. In the story, it's interesting that it takes all 7 of these dwarves and Snow White and the new king. It's a team effort to contain this wicked queen. I think that's very true for what these dynamics look like in real human life. If you think about it, the damage that one person can do if they put their mind to it, they just decide going for it. Like one person can do way more damage than one person can protect against, if that makes sense. We can especially see this with, school shootings and public shootings that happen in America. That particular form of weaponry, puts so much destructive power in the hands of an individual. But even, guns aside, I think a big part of what's often missing is the solidarity. That's definitely true when you're dealing with institutions or political movements. You have to have a mass of people who all agree and all who are in unity and support the change that needs to happen, and who are all willing to contain the force that is causing the destruction, because one person can't do it alone. So I think that's a really interesting part of the fairy tale, and something that we're usually missing. It's hard to get people to unify especially when so much could be at risk. Most people would rather just not take those kinds of risks and rather play it safe. And so we just keep getting overrun by predatory forces. And this is tough. I remember the first time I heard about the French Revolution, but I kind of walked away from that history lesson somehow thinking that like what these people did was wrong. I was like, oh, well, it would have been better if they could have found another way, than beheading the monarchy. Like that's kind of overboard was what I thought. But now as I'm coming into adulthood, I sort of understand how that happened and I understand the necessity of it. Um, and that's an interesting thing to grapple with in terms of death. So yeah, for some reason in modernity, these stories can feel really uncomfortable to us. I think it's better to have rather than to, you know, put people through a guillotine or put them in enchanted silver shoes. It would be better to put them behind bars. Putting them behind bars also requires a whole group of people to show up and maintain those boundaries and prevent these destructive people from having access to the kinds of instruments and audiences that they can use to further cause harm. So, yeah, they're really difficult questions. And it seems to me that the best solution involves a mass of people. But it's really hard to build those kinds of massive movements.
Yeah. I mean, this aspect of the storytelling that was in the Disney movie wasn't a part of the original, but I did think it was valuable, the aspect of community, of knowing the one, and how when you give people a face and a name and history and you connect them then to you heart to heart, it breaks down walls and people don't act in cruel ways. They choose to act differently. It's very similar, which it's so similar to driving a car. I just find driving cars so fascinating because we are all inside of these tin cans and we can't see anyone's face as you're driving. And if someone cuts you off, you are angry at that person, but it's because they're faceless. But if you were standing in a line or walking in a crowd and someone cut you off and they turned around and said sorry, you'd just be like, it's okay, right? It'd be such a different interaction than what it is in a car. And so much of our society makes people faceless. It makes it so that we don't connect to the one. We don't see them. We don't understand their backstory, who they love, who loves them, why they do what they do. But as soon as you put a face to someone, a heart to someone, and you understand them and you connect to them, no longer do we treat people in the ways that we're treating people right now. And I think that that's an essential key to making progress. But anyway, that was a little bit off topic. I wanted to focus back onto the myth as a parable for Heavenly Mother, actually. Bring it back to something that we are going through right now. And Hester and I had kind of talked about this a little bit about how it's interesting that if you look throughout history, you see times where the divine feminine really was very prominent, right?
Let's head into that direction with a little sound bite from Women Who Run with the Wolves, and then I'll kind of transition us in that direction.
Great.
This is a quote from Women Who Run with the Wolves, which I think very much relates to the maturation process that Snow White undergoes in this fairy tale. The quote reads like this: "At the beginning of our lives, our feminine viewpoint is very naive, meaning that emotional understanding of the covert is very faint. But this is where we all begin as females. We are naive and we talk ourselves into some very confusing situations. To be uninitiated in the ways of these matters means that we are in a time of our life when we are vulnerable to seeing only the covert. Among wolves, when the bitch leaves her pups to go hunting, the young ones try to follow her out of the den and down the path. She snarls at them, lunges at them, and scares the bejesus out of them till they run slipping and sliding back to the den. Their mother knows her pups do not yet know how to weigh and assess other creatures. They do not know who is a predator and who is not. But in time, she will teach them both harshly and well. Like wolf pups, women need a similar initiation. One teaches that the inner and outer worlds are not always happy go lucky places. Many women do not even have the basic teaching about predators that a wolf mother gives her pups, such as if it's threatening and bigger than you, flee. If it's weaker, see what you want to do. If it's sick, leave it alone. If it has quills, poison, fangs, or razor claws, back up and go in the other direction. If it smells nice but is wrapped around metal jaws, walk on by. So she's describing Snow White here. It's funny when people listen to this story and they're like, what's wrong with her? Why doesn't she get it? As Dr. Estes is saying, this is actually where we all begin. You have to be taught, you have to practice in order to see the covert. Covert means hidden. These interactions that Snow White is having with the queen comes to her in disguise. Her intentions are covert, they're hidden. She seems to be kind enough. She's offering beautiful gifts. She has such a lovely way of speaking. Snow White is so lonely. These seem like such lovely presents, right? But the intention behind it, that's what Snow White is having trouble understanding. And that's normal. That's actually very, very normal for us. And so that's why, she's having this difficulty with the dwarves. It's because she's slowly outgrowing her naivete. Now, what Dr. Estes is getting at here, she's comparing humans to wolves. She's talking about how, this particular instinct in wolves, it's actually nurtured. Wolf mothers teach their babies about this by showing them their teeth, by saying, get back in the den. Are you kidding me? You cannot come hunting with me. You do not know what you're doing yet. You're going to try to play, with the enemy. Get in there. This particular lesson is something that is, I've never seen it taught. Definitely not in Mormonism. We are not taught to see the predator, to apprehend the covert, to understand and perceive when someone's intentions might not line up with what they're saying. And I'm bringing that up as kind of a segue into our conversation about Heavenly Mother and Snow White, because you can see this at play in Mormon women, both as individuals and also generationally. The issue of Heavenly Mother is something that Mormon women generationally have been coming up against for a long time. We'll go through cycles where there will be a rise in consciousness and there will be some kind of feminist movement that happens, and then it gets clipped, its wings get clipped, the tree gets chopped down, and the movement will go back underground, and then give it a generation or so, and here we go again. And so I think Mormon women, as generationally and individually, we're usually caught in the same exact loop that Snow White is in this story, where we just can't quite figure it out. We just can't quite put our finger on it. And inevitably what happens is, in a Mormon context, it's not so much the wicked queen as it is the wicked king, you could say, archetypally. But we just keep dying. We just keep putting on the corsets and the comb and the eating the poison apple. And it's like, is this ever going to end? And, well, what do you think?
Well, yeah, honestly, I see this pattern way beyond Mormonism. I see it originating clear back in pre-antiquity happening, where the divine feminine is present, and then it's forced underground, and then over and over again in Christianity, it's coming up. We see people honoring the divine feminine in early Christianity, and then it going underground during the Nicene Creed, and then resurfacing during the Renaissance, and all these artists depicting the divine feminine in so much of their art in really hidden ways, and then it going in underground again. And then when the founding fathers are building all of these monuments, we see divine feminine symbolism happening in a lot of those monuments, and it kind of resurfacing again, but in an underground type of way. And then, within Mormonism, surfacing kind of in the late years of Joseph Smith's life, and becoming a very hot topic, talked about a lot in early historical records, and then going very quiet, and then resurfacing again, and going quiet, and resurfacing again, and just going through that cycle a little bit quicker, like you said, in almost every generation, where women are having to reinvent the wheel in every generation. I remember the first time reading Women in Authority several years after I'd kind of already been on this path of trying to understand Heavenly Mother and my own relationship with authority and patriarchy. And I read that book and I remember thinking, oh, none of my thoughts are original. I don't have a single original thought. Someone has thought all of these thoughts before me. And that was kind of painful to have that experience of why did I have to reinvent the wheel all by myself when someone else already had invented this wheel, but it was just never passed down to me. And we haven't made any progress. We just keep reinventing the wheel every generation. And then instead of momentum going forward, we just continue to stall where we've always been. And that's a sad thing to me.
It is really sad. It's so disheartening and discouraging. And I've felt the exact same feelings multiple times. So I appreciate your vulnerability in articulating those. I have a couple things to offer in response. I'm looking for a piece of writing that was coming to mind while I was listening. Can see if I can find it here quickly. Maybe not, but okay. So yes, the architecture of the Snow White story is such a great vehicle for us to talk about this pattern that you're describing. And you're right. We can see it play out in the very short history of Mormonism. And if you zoom out even further, this is the big story of the divine feminine. So I have a couple of things to offer. I think that the divine feminine and Snow White are symbols of the same thing. I think in this sense, Snow White herself may have been a regional goddess. Maybe she was a forest goddess at one point. That's what I kind of think privately, although I don't have any real proof of that. But one of the reasons I think that is because of the story itself and because of how she echoes patterns that we see play out with the divine feminine at large. So, for those of us who are women, oftentimes the initial draw towards the divine feminine is about identity. Maybe we feel deep down that there's something missing. We feel disempowered. We feel a degree of self-loathing. We want to know who we are. We want to love ourselves. And at least in Mormonism, that whole relationship and that whole gangway has kind of been set up for us. And so it might be kind of challenging, but we'll eventually kind of find our way to the Divine Mother. And for most of us, that's the initial motivation. We're looking for answers about who we are and whether we are as terrific and wonderful and sacred as we believe that we must be in our heart of hearts. And at the beginning of a relationship with the Divine Mother, you'll oftentimes get those things affirmed to you, and you'll grow and flower in this really beautiful way regarding how you relate to yourself. But the Divine Feminine is more than just a force of affirmation. The Divine Feminine is archetypally the force of transformation. And that is, I think, probably the bigger reason why she keeps coming above ground and diving back under. So in the story of Snow White is the same. She represents the force of transformation. In the myth, when her mother has conceived her, she sees these three colors: the blood on the snow, on the black wood windowsill. And she looks at this, tableau and sees her daughter in it. So in Old Europe and also in Germanic thought, these colors were very significant. They were symbols. And they were, as a collection, the symbol of transformation. Black is the negredo, red, the rubedo, and white, the albedo. These are terms associated with medieval alchemy, which maybe you've heard about in your spiritual journeying. But the idea is that transformation follows that arc. We start in the negredo, which is the dark. We can't see, we're not conscious yet. Then we move into the rubedo, the red, and that's like the open wound. It's the blood that prefigures the birth. And then we move into the albedo, that's the white, where the wound is healed. The transformation is complete. Things have been purified, and that's how these things were understood in definitely in medieval Europe, and by the looks of it, probably well beyond that. These three colors were very significant. So if we think about Snow White as the force of transformation in this story, we can understand why the Wicked Queen wants her dead. The Wicked Queen wants to maintain her seat of power. She wants to keep things the way that they are. And she feels that her power is her survival. And so she has to kill off Snow White. She has to push Snow White back. This is at the essence, I think, what happens in our human lives. So I talked earlier about this polycrisis that we're in. I think that there are definitely people involved who are predatory, who, are glutting themselves off the backs of the earth and many people with less resources. That's for sure. But I think it's also true that basically as human beings, we've built out these systems. And so now we've tied our survival in our minds and in our somas to these systems. So we resist transformation. We resist change because it threatens us. It threatens our sense of survival. And the divine feminine definitely can do that. I've seen it with men and I've also seen it with women. They'll get to a certain point in their healing, a healing process that was started because of an awakening to the divine feminine. And they'll get to a certain point where they come up against a certain issue, a certain thing from their past, and they just don't want to go down that road. They actually don't want that kind of change. And so they'll kill Snow White instead of being transformed by her. And so like if we look at it in terms of Mormonism, if Mormonism were really like tomorrow to throw open the doors on Heavenly Mother, it would radically, fundamentally change the entire thing from inside out. And you would not recognize what came afterwards. Like if women were really, if their voices were really valued equally, and their priorities were valued equally, truly. And if they were able to completely speak freely about their desires and the issues that they have with the last few thousand years of Judeo-Christian tradition, Mormonism wouldn't even be Mormonism. It would be, who knows what it would be? It would be something totally different. So human beings resist that. And this is something I've sat with for a long time. I can't offer much by way of like comfort, but what I can say is there's a lot of transformation that can occur on an individual level. There's a lot of ways that as individuals, we can make space in our lives for change to come to us. And that's something that I take very seriously and that I am very grateful to try to allow into my life. And I think, there are going to be certain constraints that will, like certain thresholds I might not be able to cross because I am a human being and my survival does depend on other human beings, but there has been a lot more room for transformation than I maybe would have imagined. So I just try to make as much space for her in my own heart and mind as I can. And to me, it seems like that's really what living a life of devotion is about. Like if you want to stay connected to truth and divine love, it will ask you to transform always. That's how it
Absolutely.
works. Yeah. So
Absolutely. Well, I think that this conversation has been absolutely fascinating. And I know that you have an incredible outline to help us understand the covert and protect ourselves from that, and maybe a path forward in gaining true wisdom. So, in our next episode, we're going to be talking about that with Hester, and I'm so excited to have that conversation. Hester is a master of language, and she does an excellent job at putting words to experiences in such a beautiful way. And in our next episode together, she's going to really help us understand that and put language to an experience that we've had, that any of us have had. Maybe it's on a personal level, maybe it's a bigger level, a social level. So I'm excited for that conversation.
thank you. I feel like we laid a really beautiful template for that conversation. So it'll be really interesting to see what parallels emerge when we reconnect in
Yeah.
November. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Hester, if people are wanting to connect to you, how do they do that? And also, why don't you tell people about what you're up to right now, how you can help them better understand story and how it can serve them in their healing journey specifically, why they would find that more valuable than just hearing a story.
This year, I'm finishing up a really beautiful program called Her Story Fairy Tales. We meet once a month and we work with a fairy tale from the European tradition. Well, it's a lot like the conversation that we just had, but we get to go around the room and hear how other people are interacting with the story and do different kinds of practices in connection with the pieces. So the first round is wrapping up at the end of October, and I'm opening up registration for a related program, which will start in November. That's called the Scheherazade cycle. A lot of the women that I've been working with want to find a way to translate these experiences for their children. So we're going to try to have like a mommy daughter fairy tale call once a week. So that's the Scheherazade cycle. And then in connection with that, we're hoping to redo Her Story Fairy Tales. So maybe once a week for a few months, we'll have a bedtime story with mommies and daughters. And then maybe once a month, we'll have a call just for grown-up women to work with the fairy tales. I think the list will probably include Snow White, Rapunzel. I've done Beauty and the Beast before. I've done the 12 Dancing Princesses, Celtic myths. Just it's a really lovely time. So if you're interested in participating in any of that, the best thing to do would be to find me on Substack. You can just search my name, Hester Murdock, HesterMurdock. I can send you, Meg, a link to the page about the Scheherazade cycle if you'd like to post that in the show
Yeah.
notes or something.
Yeah, I'll definitely put them in the show notes. And I really hope that our listeners find that intriguing.
Age 8 and up.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to be joining with my two daughters.
Yay.
That will be so fun to do. And I think that, a lot of moms and women would enjoy it. And something that I really love that Hester said is when you listen to these stories, it's a really gentle way to process through trauma, because instead of really facing those experiences head on, you can kind of address those experiences in a really gentle way through the story. And so that's why I feel like these stories are so valuable to process through our different experiences and learn from them. Hester, thank you so much for sharing with us and coming on the podcast. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, we invite you to come on over to patreon.com/inherimagepodcast for more content and community. You will have opportunities to participate in Q&A sessions, quarterly book clubs, access to a Marco Polo or Facebook group chat with our hosts, and the insider scoop on events, meetups, and retreats. We're so excited to meet you. And of course, tune in next Sunday for another inspiring episode.